So using a pen or pencil or whatever you're writing with, I want you to balance it on your finger like the picture below. Now it may take a little bit of practice, but eventually you'll find a point where you can balance the object. Now this point right here, we call it the equilibrium point. Now something interesting about the equilibrium point for most pens and pencils is the length on either side of the equilibrium point of the object is different. So for example, in this pen right here, this length is shorter than this side over here. This side is longer. So why does this happen? Well, because when you're looking for equilibrium, you're looking for something to equal each other. While the length isn't equal, so what is equal on both sides? It's actually the weight. The weight on both sides of the equilibrium point is the same. So why is this shorter? Why is this longer? Well, this side has more kind of stuff on it. It has the cap, it has the middle piece of the pen. This side doesn't have all that. So in order to balance out the weight, this side needs to be a little longer so it kind of matches the weight of this side, which has more stuff on it. Okay. Now every object has an equilibrium point, a point of balance, and some people have exploited that to create actually some really interesting kind of almost artwork here. So for example, this person who balanced these rocks here found an equilibrium point between these two rocks that kind of goes down the middle right here, so that the weight on either side is equal to each other. Okay, so you can look up rock balancing. There's a lot of really interesting and beautiful examples of this, but it's the same principle. You're just finding this equilibrium point of the object. Now it turns out that not only is there equilibrium for every object, but there's also equilibrium in economics as well. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about equilibrium, price, and quantity. So the objective for today is we will define and graph equilibrium, price, and quantity. And the closing task is I will determine the equilibrium, price, and quantity in a given supply and demand graph. Okay, so in order to figure out equilibrium, we need to review our demand and our supply graphs. So remember, demand graph looks like here on the left right here. So once again, as price goes down, quantity demand increases, or as price goes up, quantity demand decreases. And then I have my supply graph here in the middle, and this says as price goes up, quantity supply increases. As price goes down, quantity supply decreases. So we looked at these over the past few notes. Now, what you can do with these graphs, which is really interesting, is you can combine them. So when the demand and supply graph are overlapped, they create a supply and demand graph, right? So we combine these two, we add them together, and we get our supply and demand graph. To kind of visually see this, I'll try to overlap these as best as I can. I'm getting my demand graph and I'm just overlapping it with my supply graph. And you can see how it kind of creates that little X, there's a crossing point there. Okay, so that's what we're creating here on the right. We're just overlapping the graphs and we're creating a supply and demand graph. Now, something really interesting happens when you do this. Okay, first of all, your demand curve and your supply curve overlap each other at some point. So we say where the two curves meet is called the equilibrium point. So this point right here, let me pull up the pen here. So this point where the two graphs meet, where the two curves meet, we call that your equilibrium point. Okay. And I forgot to mention this, guys, but if you need a little time, make sure you do write these down. Write down the graphs. So if you need some time, you could pause the video and write them down. But I do want you to draw the graphs out. It's very important to make sure you got them drawn. All right, so this point where the supply and demand curve meet, we call this the equilibrium point. Okay, and the equilibrium point represents where supply and demand, price and quantity are equal to each other. Okay, so remember we talked about equilibrium kind of meaning equal. So what's happening here is at the equilibrium point, my demand price and my demand quantity equal my supply price and my supply quantity. So if I draw kind of a little, should be more of a straight line, but to this point right here, we say that this point is going to be my equilibrium price. Remember, price is on the y-axis. So at the equilibrium point, if I go to my price axis right here on the y-axis, this is going to be whatever my equilibrium, that's going to be my equilibrium price, whatever price is at this point right here. And the same thing goes for quantity. I go to my equilibrium point and I go down, straight down. Whatever quantity number this is, that is going to be my equilibrium quantity. Okay? So at the equilibrium point, my quantity and price are the same on my supply and my demand curves. Okay. Now this is very important because the price and quantity at the equilibrium point represents the ideal price and ideal quantity of a given good or service. Okay. We're going to get into that a little more in details in the next notes, but just keep in mind that the quantity and price at equilibrium are our ideal price and quantity. What we're going to be doing next is we're going to actually create a supply and demand graph. Okay, it's really simple. It's what we've done before. We're just kind of combining both concepts that we've covered before. So let's see how you do this. Okay, it's real easy. So I'm going to use different colors. You guys don't have to, but I'm using them just so you can visualize this a little better. I'm going to start off with the demand side, but before I get to that, I need to fill in a few details here on the graph. So once again, this is going to be my supply and demand graph. So we're combining the two graphs together. And typically what you do is you got to look at your data so you get an idea of how to fill out your axis, right? But we know that the y-axis is going to be price, and our price is in dollars. And then on the x-axis, we have our quantity. Okay, so I'm going to look at the price here on my demand data, right? So in the blue, I have my demand data. Over here in the red, I have my supply data. So I look at the price and the demand data, and I see it goes from 1 to 5. And the quantity supply data, it goes also from 1 to 5. So they're the same. They're not always going to be the same, but in this case, they are. In most cases, they are. So I'll start off with here at 0. And we're going to go from smallest to highest number. So I'm going to go from 1 all the way to 5. So I'll put 5 markers here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Once again, I want to space them out evenly. And now I can move on to the quantity section. So quantity, I go from lowest, which is 5, to highest, which is 25. Same thing over here in the supply. I go from 5 to 25. So that worked out good. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25. Okay. So now that I got my graph filled out, next I'm going to start plotting my points. So I'm going to start with the demand data first. So it says at $1, my quantity demand is 25. So I go to my price of $1, my quantity of 25, which is way over here, and I'm going to put my point there. At $2, my quantity demand is 20. So at $2, I match that with the 20. At $3, my quantity demand is 15. So I'll put that right about here. $4, my quantity demand is 10. And then at $5, my quantity demand is 5. So $5, quantity demand is 5. Okay. And notice this follows the law of demand, right? As my price starts to increase, as I go up in price, my quantity demand goes down. Okay, so that's part of the law of demand. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect these points here. Try my best to draw a nice straight line. Okay, so I've graphed my demand data. Next, I'm going to graph my supply data. So my supply data says that at $1, at the price of $1, my quantity supplied is 5. So I look at my price of $1, quantity supply is 5. At $2, it's 10. So $2, 10. $3, it's 15. At $4, it's 20. And at $5, it's 25. So that goes right about here. Same thing. I connect these points all along right there. And there you go. Now I've created my supply and demand graph. All it is a demand and supply graph overlapping each other. But what's important is when we do that, we find equilibrium. We find this point where they overlap. And they don't necessarily always overlap right in the middle. They can overlap in a lot of different spots in the graph. But for most of the examples we'll see, they'll overlap pretty much in the middle. But wherever these two graphs, these two curves overlap, we call that the equilibrium point, right? So this point right here, okay, pointing at this thing right there, that's our equilibrium point. Okay. Now the equilibrium point is important because it gives us the equilibrium price and quantity. So let's look at the equilibrium price. So from this point, our equilibrium point, and go to the left, and this is why it's important, guys, when you do this to draw your graphs as accurate as possible. Okay, so my equilibrium price is $3, right? So at equilibrium point, that's what matches. At this point right here, my price is at 3. So I'm going to say that my equilibrium price, equilibrium, my God, I spelled it really bad. Equilibrium price is $3. And then my equilibrium quantity, I do the same thing. From equilibrium point, I go straight down to my quantity at that point, and it is 15. So equilibrium quantity is 15. And there you go. So once again, this is the ideal, what this means is this is the ideal price and the ideal quantity of a good and service to produce. And we'll go into more details about that next notes, why that's the case, but just for right now, just kind of take it that that's what it is. All right. So I have a question for you guys. I want you to do this. It says create a supply and demand graph with the given data and then identify the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So look at this table right here, read it, try to understand it, and then I want you to draw a supply and demand graph for this, and then you're also going to determine equilibrium price and quantity. So pause the video. When you unpause, I'll go over the answer. Okay, so this is what your graph should look like. Once again, I know you maybe got a little confused because there's a lot of data, but just read through it. It's not as hard as it sounds, okay? We have the price of milk. And notice it just gives us the set of prices, $1, $2, and $3, okay? And then it has quantity supplied, quantity demand. So what this means is at $1, the quantity supplied is 10, but the quantity demand is 30. At $2, quantity supply is 20, quantity demand is 20. And at $3, quantity supply is 30, quantity demand is 10, okay? So you use this data to fill out the supply and the demand. So for example, at $1, my quantity supply is 10. So here on the graph at my $1, my quantity supply is 10, okay? And I'm using the red for supply. At $1, quantity demand is 30 though. So then at $1, my quantity demand is 30, and I use a blue to represent demand, okay? So the way I filled it out is I just went down this row here to fill in my points for supply. Then I went down this row to fill in my points for demand. Okay, where they intersect, that's my equilibrium point. My equilibrium price at that point is $2. Okay, so that's how I got this answer right here. And then my equilibrium quantity at that point is 20. So this is the ideal price and quantity to produce at that price. All right, so hopefully you guys thought that wasn't too bad. It's pretty simple, guys. Don't confuse yourself too much, okay? Take it like one little step at a time, and you'll see it's not too bad. So once again, we defined and graphed the equilibrium price and quantity, and then for the closing task, it says I will determine equilibrium price and quantity in a given supply and demand graph, which we did right here, as well as some other examples you guys are going to do later.